They say home is where the heart is, but what happens when your heart breaks in the very place that's supposed to protect you? What happens when the sounds of suffering from one room drown out the cries for help from another? My name is Eleanor Patterson, and at 78 years old, I'm finally ready to tell you a story that I've carried in silence for over 6 decades. It's not a story you'll want to hear during dinner, and it's certainly not one that ends with a neat little bow. But it's a story that needs telling, because somewhere out there, there's another little girl trapped between dying hope and living hell, thinking she's completely alone in this world. If that's you listening right now, know this: you're not alone, and there is a way out, even when the darkness feels endless. This happened in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, back in 1952, in a small coal mining town where everybody knew everybody's business, except for the business that happened behind closed doors, where children were meant to be seen and not heard, and girls were expected to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention they received. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I was born Eleanor May Patterson on a cold February morning in 1945, the second child to William and Dorothy Patterson. My older brother Marcus was born 3 years before me, and from the moment I could walk, it was clear that in our household, the sun rose and set on that boy. Our house sat at the end of Maple Street, a narrow 2-story building that had seen better days. The white paint was always peeling, the front porch sagged on one side, and the floorboards creaked so loudly you could track anyone's movement through the entire house. 3 bedrooms upstairs, one for my parents, one that Marcus, and I shared until I turned 8, and a tiny room that became mine when my father decided I was getting too old to share with her brother. Looking back now, I wonder if my father sensed something even then, something he chose to ignore rather than confront. My father, William Patterson, worked the coal mines like his father before him and his father's father. He was a mountain of a man, 6'2", hands like coal shovels, and a voice that could rattle the windows when he was angry, which was often. He came home every evening covered in black dust, smelling of earth and danger, his mood dependent entirely on how the day had gone below ground. On good days, he'd ruffle Marcus's hair and tell him stories about the mine. On bad days, it was better to make yourself invisible. My mother, Dorothy, was the kind of woman who seemed to shrink a little more each year. She had been beautiful once. I'd seen the wedding photos tucked away in her dresser drawer, but by the time I was old enough to really notice, she looked like a woman who had forgotten how to smile. She spent her days cooking, cleaning, mending clothes, and trying to keep the peace in a house that seemed perpetually on the edge of explosion. But it was Marcus who dominated our household in ways that went far beyond birth order. Even as a young child, he possessed a kind of charisma that drew adults to him like moths to flame. Dark hair that he wore slicked back even as a boy, piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through you, and a smile that could convince anyone of anything. The neighbors called him Little Gentleman because he was always so polite, helpful, and eager to please. That Marcus is going to be something special, Mrs. Henderson from next door would say to my mother over the fence. Mark my words, Dorothy, that boy's destined for great things. What Mrs. Henderson didn't see, what none of them saw, was the way Marcus looked at me when no adults were watching. The way his helpful nature turned possessive when it came to his little sister. The way his charming smile became something else entirely when we were alone. It started small, as these things always do. When I was 6 and he was 9, Marcus began insisting on helping me with everything. Helping me get dressed in the morning, helping me with my bath, helping me get ready for bed. My parents saw this as sweet brotherly affection. Look how he takes care of his little sister. My father would beam with pride. That's what I like to see, family looking out for family. But Marcus's help came with rules. I had to do exactly what he said, exactly when he said it. If I protested or tried to do something myself, he'd get that look in his eyes, cold and dangerous, and he'd whisper threats that chilled me to the bone. "You don't want to make me angry, Ellie," he'd say, using the nickname that only he was allowed to use. You know what happens to little girls who don't listen to their big brothers? I didn't know, actually, but his tone made it clear I didn't want to find out. Our shared bedroom became my first prison. 2 twin beds separated by a small nightstand, a single window that looked out onto the backyard, and a closet that never seemed big enough for both our belongings. Marcus had claimed the bed closer to the door. "For protection," he said, though I was never clear what he was protecting me from. At night, after our parents had gone to bed, Marcus would cross the small space between our beds and climb in beside me. At first, he claimed it was because I had nightmares, that he was comforting me. And maybe, in the beginning, part of me believed it. Maybe I even welcomed the company, the feeling that someone cared enough to chase away the monsters under the bed. But gradually, his nighttime visits became less about comfort and more about something I was too young to understand, but old enough to fear. His hands would wander where they shouldn't, his breathing would change, and he'd whisper things in my ear that made my stomach turn even though I didn't comprehend their meaning. "This is our special secret, Ellie," he'd whisper. "Brothers and sisters who really love each other have special secrets, but you can never, ever tell anyone, or terrible things will happen to you. And to Mama and Daddy, too." The threats were always vague but terrifying in their implications. He had a way of making me believe that any word I spoke about our special time would result in catastrophe for everyone I loved. So I stayed silent, night after night, letting him do things that made me feel dirty and confused and afraid. When I finally got my own room at age 8, I thought it would stop. I thought the physical barrier of separate spaces would mean safety. I was wrong. If anything, having my own room made things worse, because now Marcus could visit without the risk of waking anyone in an adjacent bed. Now he could stay longer, do more, push boundaries I didn't even know existed. My new room was directly next to my parents' bedroom, with thin walls that transmitted every sound. I could hear my father's snoring, my mother's restless tossing and turning, their muffled conversations about money and work and worry. And they could hear me too, which Marcus used to his advantage. "Make a sound," he'd threaten, "and I'll tell them you were trying to sneak out. You know what Daddy does to children who don't obey." I knew. I'd seen Marcus get the belt more than once, had watched him bite his lip bloody to keep from crying out. The idea of facing my father's wrath was almost as terrifying as what Marcus was doing to me. But it was during this time that something else began happening in our house, something that would eventually overshadow even Marcus's nocturnal visits. My mother started getting sick. It began with fatigue that seemed to go bone deep. Dorothy Patterson, who had always been the first one up in the morning and the last one to bed at night, began struggling to make it through her daily routines. Simple tasks like hanging laundry or preparing dinner would leave her breathless and pale. "Just tired," she'd say when my father asked, waving away his concern with a shaky hand. "Haven't been sleeping well, that's all." But as weeks turned to months, it became clear that this was more than simple exhaustion. The color drained from her cheeks, her clothes began hanging loose on her shrinking frame, and a persistent cough developed that kept the entire household awake at night. My father, never one to deal well with problems he couldn't fix with his hands or his will, chose to ignore the obvious signs. He'd leave for work earlier and come home later, as if avoiding the house could make the problem disappear. Marcus, meanwhile, seemed to view our mother's increasing weakness as an opportunity. "Mama's going to need our help more and more," he told me one evening as we cleared the dinner dishes. "And that means you're going to need to do exactly what I say when I say it, so we can take care of her properly." Even at 8 years old, I could sense the trap being laid. Marcus was positioning himself as the responsible older child, the one making sacrifices for the family, while simultaneously using our mother's illness to justify increased control over my life. As 1953 turned to 1954, my mother's condition worsened dramatically. What had started as fatigue and a cough became something much more serious. She began spending entire days in bed, too weak to stand for more than a few minutes at a time. The smell of sickness hung in their bedroom like a fog, a combination of medicine, sweat, and something else I couldn't name but instinctively feared. Dr. Morrison, the only physician in Millbrook, made house calls when he could, but his visits became increasingly grim. I'd watch from the top of the stairs as he spoke with my father in hushed tones, their faces grave, their voices too low for me to make out words, but loud enough to catch the tone of despair. It was during one of these visits that I first heard the word that would change everything: cancer. I didn't know what it meant then, only that it made my father's face go white and my mother cry in a way I'd never heard before. Not the sharp, angry tears of frustration, but the deep, soul-crushing sobs of someone who had just received unbearable news. That night, as my mother wept in the bedroom next to mine, Marcus came to my room with a different energy than usual. There was an excitement in his eyes that scared me more than his anger ever had. "Everything's changing now, Ellie," he whispered as he closed my bedroom door behind him. "Mama's really sick, and Daddy can't handle it. That means it's just going to be you and me taking care of things around here." He sat on the edge of my bed, his hand resting on my leg in a way that made my skin crawl. "We're going to have to be very close from now on," he continued, his voice taking on that familiar, threatening tone. "Very, very close, and you're going to have to be the best little sister you can possibly be, because if you're not—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The sound of our mother's broken crying from the next room said everything that needed to be said about what happened to people who didn't follow the rules in the Patterson household. As winter deepened and my mother's condition deteriorated, I found myself trapped between two kinds of hell. In one room, the woman who had given me life was slowly losing hers, her body betraying her bit by bit, her strength ebbing away like water through cupped hands. In the other room, her son, my brother, was betraying everything that family was supposed to mean, using her illness as cover for acts that I was still too young to fully understand, but old enough to know were wrong. And in the middle of it all was me, 9 years old, terrified, and completely alone with secrets too big and too terrible for a child to carry. The walls of our house seemed to grow thinner each night, as if the weight of all that suffering was slowly crushing the very structure around us. I could hear everything: my mother's labored breathing, my father's restless pacing, Marcus's whispered promises and threats, and underneath it all, the sound of my own heart breaking, piece by piece, night after night. But this was only the beginning. The worst was yet to come, in ways I couldn't have imagined in my darkest childhood fears. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Spring of 1954 brought no relief to the Patterson household. If anything, the warmer weather seemed to mock the cold reality settling over our family like a shroud. My mother's bedroom had become a place of hushed voices and drawn curtains, where the smell of camphor and medicine couldn't quite mask the underlying scent of something dying. Dr. Morrison's visits became weekly, then twice weekly. Each time, he left. My father would disappear into the garage for hours, the sound of hammering and cursing echoing across our small backyard. He was building something, a birdhouse, a planter box, anything to keep his hands busy and his mind off what was happening upstairs. But the sound of his labor couldn't drown out the conversations I overheard between him and the doctor. "How long?" my father asked one Tuesday evening as I crouched at the top of the stairs listening. "Hard to say, William. Could be months, could be less. The cancer's aggressive. It's in her lungs now, her liver. We're doing everything we can to keep her comfortable. Comfortable. Even at 9 years old, I understood that was doctor speak for, there's nothing more we can do. My mother, Dorothy Patterson, was dying. And Marcus knew it before any of us were ready to admit it. The night after that particular doctor's visit, Marcus appeared in my doorway with a confidence I'd never seen before. Usually, his nighttime visits carried an element of stealth, of carefully planned timing to avoid detection. But that night, he walked into my room as if he owned it, which, in many ways, he did. "Did you hear what the doctor said?" he asked, not bothering to lower his voice to his usual whisper. I nodded, afraid to speak. "Good. Then you understand that things are going to be different around here. Mama can't protect you anymore, and Daddy—" He paused, listening to the sound of our father's hammer still pounding away in the garage well past 10 p.m. "Daddy's not exactly dealing with reality right now, is he?" Marcus was right. My father had retreated so far into denial and busy work that he might as well have been living in another house entirely. He left before dawn for the mines, came home after dark, ate dinner in silence, and then disappeared into his workshop until he collapsed from exhaustion. He couldn't bear to look at any of us directly, as if acknowledging our existence would force him to confront what was happening to his wife. "That means," Marcus continued, settling onto my bed with a familiarity that made my skin crawl, "that you and I are going to get much closer. We're going to be taking care of each other in ways that most brothers and sisters never do." The way he said it made something cold and sick settle in my stomach. I wanted to run, but where would a 9-year-old girl go in a town like Millbrook? Where could anyone go when the danger lived in your own house, shared your last name, and had everyone convinced he was the perfect son? Marcus reached over and brushed a strand of hair away from my face, his touch gentle, but somehow more terrifying than if he'd been rough. "You're getting prettier, Ellie. Have I told you that lately? Almost 10 years old now and already looking like you're going to be a real beauty when you grow up." I wanted to shrink away from his touch, but I'd learned that resistance only made him angry, and angry Marcus was infinitely more dangerous than charming Marcus. "Now, here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice taking on that matter-of-fact tone that brooked no argument. "Mama's going to get sicker and sicker. She's going to need lots of care, lots of attention. Daddy's going to be working extra hours to pay for the medicine and the doctor visits. And you and I are going to have to step up and be the responsible ones." He paused, letting that sink in. "During the day, you're going to help take care of Mama. You're going to bring her food, help her to the bathroom, keep her company when she's scared. You're going to be the perfect little daughter. And at night?" His hand moved from my hair to rest on my shoulder, his grip just tight enough to remind me who was in control. "At night, you're going to take care of me. Because taking care of your family is what good girls do, isn't it, Ellie?" I nodded because I didn't know what else to do, because I was 9 years old and he was 12, and everything he said sounded like logic wrapped in affection, wrapped in threat. "That's my good girl," he said, and leaned over to kiss my forehead in a way that would have looked perfectly innocent to anyone watching. "We're going to take such good care of each other." From that night forward, my life became a carefully choreographed dance of horror. During the day, I played the role of the devoted daughter. I learned to change bedsheets without disturbing my mother's frail body, to crush pills into applesauce when she could no longer swallow them whole, to hold a basin when the medicine made her sick. My mother's bedroom became a world unto itself, separated from the rest of the house by heavy curtains and the weight of impending loss. She had good days and bad days, though the good days became increasingly rare as spring turned to summer. On the good days, she would sit up in bed and we would talk, really talk, in a way we never had before. "Ellie, honey," she said to me, one afternoon in late May, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need you to promise me something." I sat cross-legged on the bed beside her, careful not to jostle the mattress too much. What, Mama? Promise me you'll be strong. Promise me you'll take care of yourself no matter what happens. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us can't. Sometimes we have to be our own protectors. Her words hit me like a physical blow. Did she know? Had she seen something, heard something? Or was this just the rambling of a sick woman who sensed danger but couldn't name it? I promise, Mama, I whispered, though I had no idea how a 9-year-old was supposed to protect herself from anything, let alone from someone like Marcus. She squeezed my hand with what little strength she had left. You're braver than you know, sweetheart. Braver than I ever was. That conversation haunted me, especially when night fell and Marcus came calling. His visits became bolder as our mother grew weaker. Where before he had been careful to keep his voice down, now he spoke in normal tones, confident that the woman in the next room was too sick to intervene even if she heard everything, and I began to suspect that she could hear everything. The walls in our old house were thin enough that I could hear my mother's labored breathing, her occasional cries of pain, the rustle of bedsheets when she tried to find a comfortable position, which meant she could hear everything happening in my room too. One night in early June, as Marcus was visiting me, I heard my mother call out weakly from her bedroom, "Eleanor? Eleanor? Are you all right, honey?" I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell her that no, I was not all right, that her perfect son was doing terrible things to me while she lay dying just a few feet away. But Marcus's hand clamped down over my mouth before I could make a sound. "Tell her you're fine," he whispered in my ear, his breath hot and disgusting. "Tell her you had a bad dream, but you're fine now." He removed his hand slowly, his eyes promising terrible consequences if I said anything other than what he'd instructed. I'm okay, Mama," I called back, my voice shaking. "Just had a bad dream. Go back to sleep." "All right, sweetheart. If you need anything." Her voice trailed off as exhaustion claimed her again. I heard the creak of her bed as she settled back down, and then there was only the sound of her difficult breathing and Marcus's satisfied chuckle. "See how easy that was?" he whispered. "Mama's too sick to help you even if she wanted to. And Daddy, well, Daddy's got bigger things to worry about than whatever you might imagine is happening to you." He was right, and we both knew it. Father had become a ghost in his own home, present in body but absent in every way that mattered. He ate his meals in silence, went through the motions of checking on my mother, and then escaped to his workshop where he could pretend that hammering nails was somehow going to fix what was broken in our family. The few times I tried to approach him, standing in the doorway of the garage, watching him work, he would look at me with such pain in his eyes that I couldn't bear to add to his burden. How could I tell him that while his wife was dying, his son was destroying his daughter? How could I shatter what little was left of his world? So I said nothing. I carried the secret alone, night after night, as my mother grew weaker, and Marcus grew bolder. By July, my mother could no longer leave her bed. She slept most of the day, waking only when the pain became too much to bear, or when she needed help with the most basic functions. I became her primary caregiver during the daylight hours, a 9-year-old girl playing nurse to a dying woman. Dr. Morrison taught me how to check her temperature, how to give her the morphine that helped with the pain, how to keep her comfortable when comfort was all we had left to offer. I learned to read the signs, when her breathing became more labored, when her skin took on that waxy pallor that meant she was having a particularly bad day, when the pain medication wasn't enough. "You're a good girl, Eleanor," Dr. Morrison told me one sweltering afternoon as we stood outside my mother's room. "You're doing more than most adults could handle. Your mother is lucky to have you." Lucky. The word felt like a bitter joke. What kind of luck was it that left a dying woman dependent on a child who was being violated nightly by her own son? But I smiled and nodded, because that's what good girls did. Good girls didn't complain. Good girls didn't make waves. Good girls certainly didn't accuse their older brothers of unspeakable acts. The summer heat made everything worse. Our house had no air conditioning, just a few strategically placed fans that moved the hot air around without really cooling anything. My mother's room became stifling, the smell of sickness intensified by the oppressive temperature. I spent hours applying cool clothes to her forehead, trying to provide some small measure of relief. It was during one of these cooling sessions that my mother grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "Eleanor," she whispered urgently, "I need to tell you something about Marcus, about your brother." My heart stopped. Did she know? Had she finally heard something that made her understand what was happening? "Mama?" She struggled to focus on my face, the morphine making her thoughts fuzzy but the urgency still clear in her eyes. He's not what he seems. I've heard." She paused, fighting to find the words. "You must be careful, sweetheart. You must protect yourself. Promise me." "I promise, Mama," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I promise." But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were empty. How was a 9-year-old supposed to protect herself from someone who had complete power over her? Someone who had convinced everyone else that he was perfect while systematically destroying the one person who couldn't fight back? That night when Marcus came to my room, I tried something different. I tried to be strong like my mother had asked. "I don't want you to come here anymore," I said, my voice barely audible but steady. "Mama knows something's wrong. She told me to be careful." Marcus laughed, a sound that chilled me to the bone. "Mama knows lots of things, Ellie. She knows she's dying. She knows Daddy can't cope. She knows that in a few weeks or months, she's going to be gone and it'll just be the 3 of us left." He sat down on my bed, his presence filling the small room like a dark cloud. "What she doesn't know is exactly what I do to you every night. And what she'll never know is that it's going to get much, much worse once she's not here to accidentally interrupt us." The casual way he talked about our mother's death, the way he saw it as an opportunity rather than a tragedy, made me realize that Marcus wasn't just someone who did bad things. He was someone who enjoyed them, someone who planned them, someone who had been waiting for the perfect circumstances to escalate his behavior, and those circumstances were coming whether I was ready or not. As August arrived with its suffocating heat and the constant buzz of cicadas, my mother's condition took a dramatic turn for the worse. She stopped eating entirely, could barely stay awake for more than a few minutes at a time, and her breathing became so labored that each breath sounded like a struggle against the inevitable. Dr. Morrison stopped giving us timelines. Instead, he talked about making her comfortable and preparing for the end. My father finally stopped pretending that work could distract him from reality and began spending his evenings sitting beside my mother's bed, holding her hand and whispering apologies for things only they understood. And Marcus? Marcus watched, it all with the patience of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "Soon, Ellie," he would whisper as I passed him in the hallway. "Very soon. It's going to be just you and me. And then we can really start being a family." The most terrifying part wasn't what he was already doing to me. It was the promise in his voice that suggested everything up until now had been merely practice for what was coming next. The first week of September 1954 brought an unseasonable chill to Millbrook, as if nature itself was preparing for what was to come. The leaves hadn't yet started turning, but there was something in the air that whispered of endings, of final chapters being written in houses where curtains stayed drawn and hope had long since withered. My mother hadn't spoken in 3 days. She lay in her bed like a fragile bird, her breathing so shallow that I sometimes had to lean close just to make sure she was still alive. Her skin had taken on a translucent quality, as if she was already halfway to becoming a ghost. Dr. Morrison had stopped coming for regular visits. There was nothing left for him to do except wait for the phone call that would officially end what everyone already knew was over. My father had aged a decade in the past month. His thick, black hair now showed streaks of silver, and lines had appeared around his eyes that made him look like a stranger wearing my daddy's face. He no longer pretended to go to work. Instead, he sat beside my mother's bed from dawn until dusk, holding her hand and talking to her in low tones, as if he could somehow call her back from wherever she was drifting. "Remember our first dance, Dot?" he would whisper, using the nickname he'd called her since they were teenagers. "You wore that blue dress with the little flowers. You were so beautiful. I forgot the steps and stepped on your feet 3 times. Sometimes I thought I saw her eyelids flutter in response. But it might have been wishful thinking. We were all grasping for signs of life in a woman who was already letting go. Marcus, meanwhile, had transformed into something I barely recognized. Gone was any pretense of the charming boy everyone else knew. In its place was someone calculating and cold. Someone who moved through our house like he was already planning its funeral. He spoke to neighbors and church visitors with perfect politeness, accepting their casseroles and condolences with just the right amount of brave little boy sadness. But when they left, when it was just family again, his mask slipped completely. "Any day now?" he told me on a Tuesday morning as we stood in the kitchen, the sound of our father's weeping drifting down from upstairs. "Any day now, and then everything changes." He was buttering toast with mechanical precision, as if this was just another ordinary breakfast on just another ordinary day. But there was nothing ordinary about the way he looked at me over the kitchen table, nothing normal about the promise in his eyes. "Have you thought about what happens next, Ellie? After the funeral, after all the neighbors stop bringing food and checking on us? When it's just Daddy trying to figure out how to keep going, and you and I left to take care of each other?" I had thought about it, actually. I'd thought about it every night as I lay in my bed, listening to my mother's labored breathing through the thin wall, knowing that Marcus was listening too, waiting. The thought of facing him without even the fragile protection of my dying mother's presence filled me with a terror so complete it felt like drowning. "Daddy will protect me," I whispered, though even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Marcus laughed, a sound devoid of any humor. "Daddy can't even protect himself right now. Look at him, Ellie. Really look at him. Does that seem like a man who's going to be paying attention to what his children are doing?" He was right, and we both knew it. My father had retreated so far into his grief that he might as well have been living on another planet. Even when he was physically present, his mind was somewhere else entirely, lost in memories of better times or paralyzed by the reality of what was coming. "Besides," Marcus continued, taking a bite of his toast as casually as if we were discussing the weather. "I've been the man of this house for months now. I'm the one who's been taking care of everything while Daddy falls apart. The neighbors see it. The church people see it. Everyone knows I'm the responsible one." This was true too, in the most twisted way possible. To the outside world, Marcus had indeed stepped up admirably. He answered the door when visitors came calling, helped carry in the endless stream of casseroles and sympathy gifts, spoke to adults with a maturity that impressed everyone who met him. What they didn't see was how he used that newfound authority at home, how he leveraged every act of responsibility into greater control over our household. "Mrs. Henderson told Daddy just yesterday, 'What a fine young man I'm becoming,'" Marcus said, his voice taking on that self-satisfied tone that made my skin crawl. "How lucky they are to have a son who can shoulder adult responsibilities. How proud Mama would be." The mention of our mother's pride in connection with his behavior made bile rise in my throat. If she knew what he really was, what he was really doing to me while she lay dying just feet away, pride would be the last thing she'd feel. That afternoon brought visitors, members of our church congregation led by Pastor Williams, A kind man with gentle eyes who had been trying to provide spiritual comfort to our family during these dark times. They gathered in our living room, speaking in hushed tones about God's plan and the peace that comes after suffering, while upstairs my mother drifted in and out of consciousness. "How are you children holding up?" Pastor Williams asked, looking between Marcus and me with genuine concern. "This must be so difficult for you both." "We're managing, Pastor," Marcus replied with exactly the right amount of brave stoicism. "Eleanor has been such a help taking care of Mama, and I've been trying to support Daddy as much as I can. We know that God has a plan, even when we can't understand it." The adults in the room exchanged meaningful looks, the kind that said, "What remarkable children, what a credit to their parents." Mrs. Henderson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Your mother raised you right," she said to Marcus. "Both of you. She can rest easy knowing her children are so strong." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell them all exactly what kind of strength Marcus really had, what kind of help he'd been providing me with. But the words stuck in my throat like stones, weighed down by months of conditioning, by the absolute certainty that no one would believe me even if I found the courage to speak. After the visitors left, carrying with them their good intentions and their complete blindness to what was really happening in our house, Marcus cornered me in the hallway outside my mother's room. "Did you see that, Ellie? Did you see how they all look at me? How can they trust me?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. "That's what everyone's going to remember when Mama's gone. Not whatever stories a confused little girl might try to tell, but the upstanding young man who held his family together during their darkest hour." He stepped closer, backing me against the wall. Through the thin door, I could hear my father's voice, soft and broken, reading aloud from one of my mother's favorite books of poetry. "And even if you did try to tell someone," Marcus continued, "even if you found the courage to open that little mouth of yours and make accusations, who do you think they'd believe? The grieving daughter who's clearly been traumatized by watching her mother die? Or the responsible son who's been nothing but helpful and mature through this whole ordeal?" The terrible thing was, he was absolutely right. In the 1950s, in a small town like Millbrook, the word of a 12-year-old boy with a sterling reputation would always carry more weight than the accusations of his younger sister. Especially accusations so shocking, so unthinkable, that most adults would refuse to believe them purely because accepting their truth would shatter their understanding of how the world was supposed to work. That night, as if sensing that time was running short, my mother rallied briefly. It was around 9 o'clock when I heard her call my name in a voice stronger than any she'd managed in weeks. I rushed to her bedside to find her eyes open and focused in a way they hadn't been for days. "Eleanor, baby," she whispered, reaching for my hand with fingers that felt like bird bones wrapped in tissue paper. "Come close. I need to tell you something important." I leaned down until my ear was almost touching her lips, aware that my father had stepped out to get her evening medication and that Marcus was somewhere else in the house. "There's money," she breathed, each word clearly an effort. "Hidden in my jewelry box behind the mirror. Not much, but enough. If you ever have to get away." She trailed off, her eyes closing with exhaustion, but her grip on my hand remained surprisingly strong. "Mama?" I whispered. "Get away from what?" Her eyes opened again, and in them I saw not the vague confusion of the past weeks, but a clarity that was almost frightening in its intensity. "From him," she said simply. "From your brother." "I know, sweetheart. I've always known. I couldn't. I was too weak to stop it." The words hit me like a physical blow. She knew. My mother knew what Marcus had been doing to me, and she was dying with that knowledge, leaving me alone with a monster she'd been too sick to fight. "Mama, please," I sobbed, clutching her hand. "Don't leave me with him. Please don't die." But even as I begged, I could see life fading from her eyes again. the brief moment of clarity giving way to the fog of medication and approaching death. "Be strong," she whispered, so quietly I almost missed it. Stronger than I was. Don't let him win. Those were the last coherent words my mother ever spoke to me. By the time my father returned with her pills, she had slipped back into unconsciousness, and this time she didn't wake up. She died 3 days later, on a gray Saturday morning, in mid-September, with my father holding one hand and me holding the other. Marcus stood at the foot of the bed, watching with an expression I couldn't read but that chilled me to the bone. When her breathing finally stopped, when the struggle that had defined the last months of her life finally ended, my father collapsed, into sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. I cried too, for the mother I was losing, for the protection that was ending, for the childhood that was about to be buried along with her. But underneath my grief was a terror so complete it felt like falling into an endless pit. Because I knew that with my mother's last breath, any barrier between Marcus and me had died too. The thin wall that had separated his room from our dying, mother's concern was gone. The fading hope that she might somehow intervene, somehow save me, was buried with her beneath 6 feet of Pennsylvania soil. The funeral was everything you'd expect in a small town in 1954, crowded, somber, filled, with people who genuinely cared about our family's loss, but who had no idea what that loss really meant for me. Marcus played his role perfectly, the grieving son supporting his devastated father, accepting condolences with dignity beyond his years, helping to carry his mother's casket with steady hands and dry eyes. Everyone remarked on what a strong boy he was, how well he was handling such a terrible situation. What they didn't see was the way he looked at me across the gravesite, the way his eyes promised that our real life together was just beginning. The house felt different when we returned from the cemetery, empty in a way that went beyond the absence of one person. It was as if my mother's death had sucked all the warmth and safety out of our home, leaving behind only shadows and the echo of Marcus's footsteps as he moved through rooms that were now completely his domain. That first night after the funeral, I lay in my bed listening to my father crying in the room next door, the room where my mother had died, where her absence now filled every corner like a living thing. I waited for Marcus to come, knowing he would, knowing that nothing stood between us anymore. When my bedroom door finally opened, he didn't sneak or whisper like he had before. He walked in with the confidence of someone who owned everything. He surveyed. "Hello, Ellie," he said in a normal voice, not bothering to keep quiet. "I think it's time we had a real conversation about how things are going to work from now on." The longest night of my life was about to begin. That first night, after my mother's funeral changed everything, when Marcus walked into my room with that new confidence, that complete lack of secrecy, I realized that whatever had been happening before was just the beginning. The real nightmare was about to start. "Sit up, Ellie," he commanded, not bothering, with his usual whispered threats. "We need to establish some new rules for how this household is going to work." I pulled myself up against my headboard, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Through the wall, I could still hear my father's muffled sobs, the sound of a grown man completely broken by grief. "First rule," Marcus said, settling, himself on the edge of my bed as if he belonged there. "You don't make any noise, ever. Daddy's got enough to deal with right now without being disturbed by whatever foolishness you might think to complain about." He gestured toward the wall separating my room from our parents, now just our fathers. "Second rule, you do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you. No questions, no hesitation, no resistance. I'm the man of this house now, and that means my word is law." The casual way he claimed authority, as if it was his natural birthright, rather than something stolen through manipulation and violence, made my stomach turn. "Third rule, and this is the most important one, Ellie," he continued, his voice taking on that edge that had always preceded his worst behavior. "You belong to me now, Completely. Your body, your time, your thoughts, all of it belongs to me. And I'm going to use what's mine, however I see fit. What happened next was worse than anything that had come before. Without my mother's presence, in the next room, without even the pretense of secrecy, Marcus revealed the full extent of what he was capable of. The things he did to me that night, the ways he hurt me, the words he used to describe what was happening. It was as if my mother's death had removed not just a barrier, but any remaining trace of humanity from his behavior. When he was finished, when he finally left me alone and bleeding in my bed, I understood something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Everything before had been preparation. Marcus had been training me, conditioning me to accept his control, but he had been holding back, limited by circumstances. Now, with those circumstances removed, I was about to discover what he was really capable of. The weeks that followed my mother's funeral blurred together in a haze of pain, fear, and desperate survival. My father retreated so completely into his grief that he became little more than a ghost haunting our house. He would sit for hours in my mother's rocking chair, staring at nothing, speaking to no one. Neighbors brought food that he barely touched. He stopped shaving, stopped changing clothes, stopped acknowledging that the world continued to exist around him. "Look at him," Marcus said to me one morning as we watched our father through the kitchen window. He was sitting on the back porch, in the same clothes he'd worn to the funeral 2 weeks earlier, staring blankly at my mother's garden as it slowly withered without her care. "That's not a man anymore, Ellie. That's a broken toy, and broken toys can't protect anyone." Marcus had taken over all the household responsibilities with an efficiency that both impressed and terrified me. He answered the door when neighbors came calling, accepted their condolences and casseroles with perfect grace, and handled the financial matters that my father couldn't face. To the outside world, he was the heroic son stepping up to keep his family together during their darkest hour. What they didn't see was how he used that newfound authority. "Mrs. Henderson brought another casserole," he announced one evening, setting the covered dish on our kitchen table. "She asked how we're all doing, and I told her we're managing as well as can be expected. I also told her that Daddy needs time to grieve, and that I'm taking care of everything so he doesn't have to worry." He looked at me meaningfully as he said this last part. She was very impressed with how responsible I'm being. Very impressed with how well I'm taking care of my little sister during this difficult time. The word care in his mouth sounded like poison. Because Marcus's version of care involved things that no brother should ever do to a sister. Things that left marks he then had to explain away when concerned neighbors noticed my increasingly withdrawn behavior. "Eleanor's been having nightmares about Mama," he would tell anyone who asked about my hollow eyes and constant flinching. "She's not sleeping well, not eating much. It's normal for children to have trouble processing grief." And people believed him because why wouldn't they? Marcus was articulate, thoughtful, clearly mature beyond his years. When he explained that I was struggling with our mother's death, it made perfect sense to everyone who saw my deteriorating condition. What they didn't understand was that my nightmares about Mama were actually the reality of what Marcus did to me every single night. That my trouble sleeping came from lying awake in terror, wondering what new horror he would subject me to. That my lack of appetite was because fear had twisted my stomach into permanent knots. October arrived with its brilliant fall colors, but I barely noticed the beauty around me. My world had narrowed to the confines of our house, to the careful navigation of Marcus's moods and demands. He had developed a routine that was as predictable as it was horrifying. During the day, he maintained his perfect facade, the responsible older brother caring for his traumatized family. He would help me get ready for school, walk me there and back, assist with homework, prepare simple meals that our father rarely touched. To anyone watching, we looked like a family pulling together during a tragedy. But the moment the sun went down, The moment we were alone in our house with our catatonic father, Marcus transformed into something else entirely. Someone else entirely. "Time for your real education, Ellie," he would say as darkness fell, his voice carrying that familiar promise of pain disguised as affection. School became my only refuge, but even that was tainted by Marcus's presence. He insisted on walking me to and from my classes, claiming it was for my protection, but I knew it was really about control. He wanted to know where I was at all times, who I talked to, what I might say. My teacher, Mrs. Morrison, no relation to our doctor, noticed my declining performance and called me aside one afternoon in late October. "Eleanor, honey," she said gently, crouching down to my eye level as I sat at my desk after the other children had been dismissed. "I'm worried about you. Your grades have slipped. You seem tired all the time, and you've stopped participating in class discussions. I know losing your mother must be incredibly difficult, but is there anything else bothering you? Anything you need to talk about?" For a moment, a brief, shining moment, I considered telling her everything. Mrs. Morrison was kind, patient, someone who genuinely seemed to care about her students' well-being. Maybe she would believe me. Maybe she would help. But then I remembered Marcus's warnings, his detailed descriptions of what would happen if I ever tried to tell anyone about our special relationship. More importantly, I remembered his reputation in our community, the universal praise for how well he was handling our family crisis. "I just miss Mama," I said finally, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. "Sometimes I can't sleep because I think about her." Mrs. Morrison's expression softened with sympathy. "Of course you do, sweetheart. That's perfectly normal. You know what? I think it might help if you talk to someone about your feelings. There's a nice lady, Mrs. Parker, who comes to the school sometimes to help children who are going through difficult times. Would you like me to arrange for you to meet with her?" The suggestion terrified me more than anything Marcus had ever done. A counselor would ask questions, real questions, probing questions. She might notice things that others had missed. And if she started investigating our family situation too closely— "No, thank you," I said quickly. "I'm okay, really. Marcus takes good care of me." Mrs. Morrison smiled, completely missing the bitter irony in my words. "That's wonderful, Eleanor. It sounds like you're very lucky to have such a caring big brother." Lucky. That word again. If only she knew what Marcus's version of care actually involved. That conversation haunted me as Marcus walked me home from school that afternoon. What if I had said yes to meeting Mrs. Parker? What if I had found the courage to tell Mrs. Morrison the truth? But every time I considered the possibility, I remembered my mother's hidden money, still untouched in her jewelry box, and wondered if that might be a better option than trying to convince adults who already saw Marcus as a hero. November brought the first snow, early and heavy, blanketing our house in a white silence that seemed to muffle even the sound of my father's continued grief. He had begun talking to my mother's photograph, carrying on long conversations with her picture as if she could hear him and respond. Sometimes I would find him in their bedroom, lying on her side of the bed, holding her pillow and weeping. Marcus found these displays of grief both pathetic and useful. "Look at him, Ellie," he said one evening as we watched our father through the living room doorway. "Still talking to a dead woman like she's going to answer back. Do you think a man in that condition is going to notice what's happening to his daughter? Do you think he's capable of protecting anyone?" He was right, and we both knew it. My father had retreated so far into his own pain that he might as well have been living on another planet. Even when Marcus's abuse of me happened in the same house, sometimes just rooms away from where our father sat lost in his memories, there was no danger of discovery. It was during this time that Marcus introduced new elements to his nightly visits, things that went beyond what he had done before. He seemed driven by a need to push boundaries, to explore the full extent of his power over me. What had started as inappropriate touching had evolved into something much worse, much more violent. "You're growing up, Ellie," he told me one snowy evening in late November as he stood in my doorway, silhouetted against the hall light like some kind of demon. "And that means our relationship needs to grow up too." I won't detail what he did to me that night or the nights that followed. Some things are too dark to speak aloud, too terrible to give voice to even now, 70 years later. But I will say this. By December of 1954, I understood that Marcus wasn't just abusing me. He was systematically destroying me, piece by piece, night by night. The physical pain was constant now, a dull ache that never completely went away. But worse than the physical pain was the psychological damage, the way he made me feel complicit in my own victimization. He had a talent for twisting everything, for making me believe that I was somehow responsible for what was happening, that I had somehow invited or deserved his attention. "You like this," he would whisper in my ear during his worst moments. "You must like it, or you would fight harder. You would scream louder. But you don't, do you, Ellie? You just lie there and take it like a good little girl." The terrible thing was, he was partially right. I had stopped fighting, stopped screaming, stopped resisting in any meaningful way. Not because I enjoyed what he was doing, but because I had learned that resistance only made him angrier, only made the pain worse. I had developed a kind of psychological armor, a way of disconnecting my mind from my body during his visits, floating somewhere above the horror and waiting for it to end. But this survival mechanism came with a cost. I was disappearing, bit by bit, becoming a hollow shell of the girl I had once been. My reflection in the mirror looked like a stranger, hollow-eyed, too thin, carrying shadows that had nothing to do with the lighting. It was around this time that I began to seriously consider my mother's hidden money. Late at night, after Marcus had finished with me and returned to his own room, I would lie awake thinking about that small cache of bills hidden behind the mirror in her jewelry box. It wasn't much, maybe $20 or $30, but it might be enough for a bus ticket somewhere, anywhere that wasn't here. The fantasy of escape became my lifeline during the darkest moments. When Marcus was hurting me, when the pain became too much to bear, I would imagine myself walking away from our house, from our town, from everything that had become a prison. I pictured myself as someone else, somewhere else, living a life where no one could hurt me. But I was 10 years old. Where could a 10-year-old girl go that a determined older brother couldn't find her? And what would happen to my father if I disappeared? As broken as he was still my daddy, and abandoning him felt like another kind of betrayal. So I stayed. I endured. I survived one night at a time, telling myself that somehow, someday, things would change. That Marcus would get tired of his games, or that my father would emerge from his grief long enough to notice what was happening, or that some miracle would deliver me from this hell. I had no way of knowing then that the real test was still to come, that what I had endured so far was nothing compared to what Marcus had planned for the deepest, darkest days of winter. I had no idea that my mother's death had been just the beginning of my nightmare, not the end of any hope for protection. December was coming, and with it, Marcus's most terrible escalation yet. December 1954 arrived with a vengeance, bringing, with it, the kind of bitter cold that seemed to seep into your bones and settle there permanently. The snow that had started in November now piled up against our windows in drifts that blocked out much of the daylight, turning our house into a tomb of perpetual twilight. It was the perfect setting for what Marcus had planned. The isolation was complete now. School had closed early for winter break due to a furnace malfunction, leaving me trapped in the house with Marcus and our increasingly distant father. The neighbors who had been so attentive in the weeks following my mother's funeral had retreated to their own homes, their own holiday preparations, leaving us to our private hell. My father had stopped speaking entirely. He spent his days sitting, in my mother's rocking chair, wrapped in one of her old quilts, staring out at the snow-covered garden where her flowers lay buried until spring. Sometimes I would bring him food, placing the plate on the small table beside his chair, and he would look at me with eyes so full of pain that I had to turn away. The food would sit there untouched until Marcus or I eventually cleared it away. It was as if my father was slowly disappearing, fading away bit by bit like a photograph left too long in the sun. Dr. Morrison had stopped by once in early December, expressing concern about what he called complicated grief, but my father had refused to speak with him. After 20 minutes of one-sided conversation, the doctor had pulled Marcus aside. "Your father needs professional help," I heard him tell my brother in our kitchen. "This level of withdrawal isn't normal grief. It's something more serious. There are facilities, hospitals that specialize in this kind of thing." But Marcus had smoothly deflected the suggestion, painting himself as the dutiful son managing an impossible situation. "Dr. Morrison, I appreciate your concern, but I think what Daddy needs most right now is to stay in familiar surroundings, with his family. He's been through so much. Losing Mama was devastating for all of us. I think moving him to some institution would just make things worse." The doctor had nodded sympathetically, completely taken in by Marcus's performance. "You're probably right, son. You're showing remarkable maturity for your age. Your parents should be proud of the young man you're becoming. If only he knew what kind of young man Marcus was really becoming." With the doctor's visit handled and no other authority figures likely to interfere during the holiday break, Marcus's behavior reached new depths of cruelty. It was as if the winter isolation had given him permission to explore the darkest corners of his nature without fear of discovery. Christmas approached like a death sentence. In previous years, my mother had filled our house with the warm scents of baking cookies and pine garland, with the soft glow of candles in the windows and carefully wrapped presents under a tree that reached nearly to our ceiling. This year, there was no tree, no decorations, no acknowledgement that the holiday existed at all. "Why bother?" Marcus said when I hesitantly asked if we might put up some of my mother's decorations. "Christmas is for families, Ellie. Happy families. And we're not happy, are we?" He was standing behind me as I washed dishes at the kitchen sink, his hands resting on my shoulders in a way that would have looked affectionate to anyone watching. But his grip was tight enough to leave bruises, and his voice carried that familiar undercurrent of threat. "Besides," he continued, "we have our own way of celebrating now, our own special traditions." I knew what he meant, and the knowledge made me sick to my stomach. Marcus had been hinting for weeks about some special Christmas surprise he had planned for me, something that would make all his previous visits seem tame by comparison. The night of December 23rd, he made his intentions clear. "Tomorrow is Christmas Eve, Ellie," he said as he entered my room that night, his silhouette dark against the hallway light. "A night for families to come together, to share intimate moments, to give each other special gifts." He sat down on my bed, the mattress dipping under his weight, and I instinctively pressed myself against the headboard as far away from him as possible. "I've been planning something very special for you," he continued, his voice taking on that sickly sweet tone that always preceded his worst behavior. "Something that will show you just how much you mean to me, just how important our relationship really is." He reached out and touched my face, his fingers cold against my skin, and I had to fight not to flinch away. Any sign of resistance would only make what was coming worse. "You're going to help me show Daddy what a real family looks like," Marcus said. "What happens when people truly love each other the way brothers and sisters should?" The implication hit me like a physical blow. He wasn't just planning to hurt me. He was planning to force our father to witness it, to destroy whatever remained of our family in one terrible moment. "Marcus, please," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Don't involve Daddy. He's already so hurt, so broken. Please don't make it worse." But Marcus just smiled, And in that smile I saw something that chilled me more than the December wind rattling our windows. This wasn't just about power or control anymore. This was about complete destruction, about taking apart everything that remained of our family and rebuilding it in his own twisted image. Daddy needs to understand the truth about us, Ellie, about how much we love each other, about how I'm taking care of you in ways he never could. Marcus's hand moved to my throat, not squeezing, but resting there like a promise. Once he sees how special our relationship is, he'll understand why you belong to me. Why have you always belonged to me? That night, I lay awake long after Marcus had left my room, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what he had told me. The idea of my father being forced to witness Marcus's abuse was so terrifying that my mind kept rejecting it, unable to fully comprehend the level of cruelty involved. But as the hours passed and Christmas Eve dawned gray and cold, I began to understand that Marcus wasn't bluffing. He had been building toward this moment for months, maybe even years. Every act of violence, every violation had been preparation for this ultimate assertion of his power. I thought about my mother's hidden money, still untouched in her jewelry box. $27. I had counted it one desperate night when the urge to flee had become almost overwhelming. It might be enough for a bus ticket to somewhere, anywhere. But even if I could escape, what would happen to my father? In his current state, he was helpless as a child. Leaving him alone with Marcus felt like signing his death warrant. Christmas Eve arrived with a fresh snowfall that blocked our driveway and sealed us even more completely into our white prison. I went through the motions of the day, preparing meals that my father wouldn't eat, cleaning a house that felt more like a mausoleum with each passing hour, avoiding Marcus's increasingly predatory gaze. As evening approached, Marcus's excitement became palpable. He hummed while he moved through the house, arranging things with a deliberate precision that made my skin crawl. He built up the fire in our living room until it roared in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He moved furniture around, positioning chairs in ways that served his purposes rather than comfort. "Such a special night," he kept saying, catching my eye with meaningful looks. "Such a very special night for our family." My father remained in his rocking chair, seemingly oblivious to the preparations happening around him. But I noticed something that chilled me. Marcus had positioned the chair so that it faced the sofa where he clearly intended for his show to take place. As night fell and the house settled into its familiar creaking silence, I made a desperate decision. I couldn't run away and abandon my father, but I could try one last time to reach him, to break through the wall of grief that had separated him from reality for so long. I found him in his usual spot, staring out at the snow-covered darkness. My mother's quilt pulled tight around his shoulders. In the firelight, he looked ancient, worn down to nothing but bones and sorrow. "Daddy?" I whispered, kneeling beside his chair. "Daddy, I need to talk to you. I need you to listen to me." For a moment, just a moment, his eyes focused on my face with something approaching recognition. "Eleanor?" he said, his voice rusty from weeks of disuse. "Baby girl?" "Yes, Daddy, it's me." Tears were streaming down my face now, but I pressed on. "Daddy, I need you to understand something about Marcus, about what he's been doing to me." But even as I spoke, I could see the awareness fading from his eyes, the brief moment of clarity dissolving back into the fog of his grief. He reached out and touched my hair with a shaking hand. "You look so much like your mama," he whispered. "So much like my Dorothy." And then he was gone again, retreating back into the safe space in his mind where my mother was still alive, and nothing terrible could touch their love. It was then that I heard Marcus's footsteps on the stairs, deliberate and measured, like a countdown to execution. I looked up to see him standing in the doorway of the living room, no longer bothering to hide the anticipation in his eyes. "Time for our Christmas celebration, Ellie," he said, his voice carrying across the room with absolute authority. Time for Daddy to see what a loving family really looks like. I stood on shaking legs, knowing that the moment I had been dreading for weeks had finally arrived. But as I took my first step toward Marcus, something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the sight of my father's complete helplessness, or maybe it was the realization that Marcus intended to destroy the last shreds of innocence in our house. Whatever it was, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Rage. Pure, clean, burning rage that cut through the fear and the conditioning and the learned helplessness like a knife through silk. "No," I said, the word coming out stronger than I had intended. Marcus raised an eyebrow, more amused than concerned by this unexpected resistance. "Excuse me?" I said no. I took a step backward, putting the coffee table between us. "I won't do this anymore. Not in front of Daddy. Not ever again." For a moment, Marcus looked genuinely surprised. Then his expression darkened, and I saw the monster that usually hid behind his charming facade emerge fully into the firelight. "You seem to have forgotten who makes the rules in this house, little sister," he said, moving around the coffee table with predatory grace. "Let me remind you." But as he reached for me, as his hand shot out to grab my arm and drag me to where he wanted me, I did something I had never done before in all the months of abuse and terror. I fought back. I grabbed the poker from beside the fireplace and swung it with all the strength my 10-year-old body could muster, catching Marcus across the shoulder and sending him stumbling backward in shock. "You little bitch!" he snarled, his mask slipping completely now. "You're going to pay for that!" But I was already moving, already running, the poker still clutched in my hands as I raced toward the stairs. Behind me, I could hear Marcus cursing, could hear him starting to follow. But I had a head start and desperation lending speed to my feet. I burst into my mother's old room, slamming the door behind me and throwing the small lock that wouldn't hold Marcus for long, but might give me a few precious seconds. My hands were shaking as I went to her jewelry box, finding the hidden compartment behind the mirror and pulling out the small roll of bills. $27. My entire future clutched in my trembling hands. Outside my door, I could hear Marcus's voice, no longer trying to maintain any pretense of normalcy. "Open this door, Eleanor. Open it right now, or I swear to God, what I do to you will make everything before seem like a gentle kiss." But I was already at the window, already pushing. It opened despite the December cold that rushed in like a living thing. The roof of our back porch was just below, covered in snow but reachable. As I heard the door behind me splinter under Marcus's assault, I made the choice that would define the rest of my life. I jumped. The impact of hitting the snowy porch roof knocked the breath from my lungs and sent sharp pain shooting through my left ankle. For a moment, I lay there in the freezing darkness, snow soaking through my thin nightgown, listening to Marcus's enraged bellowing from the window above. "Eleanor, get back here right now. You can't run from me. There's nowhere to go." But I was already moving, rolling off the porch roof and dropping the remaining 8 feet to the ground below. My ankle screamed in protest as I hit the frozen earth, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I scrambled to my feet and ran toward the tree line behind our house, clutching my mother's money in one hand and ignoring the bite of snow against my bare feet. Behind me, I could hear Marcus crashing through the house, probably racing for the front door to cut off my escape. But I knew our property better than he realized, knew about the gap in the Hendersons' fence where I used to squeeze through as a smaller child, knew the path through Miller's Woods that would take me to the main road without having to go through town. The December night was brutal. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and fresh snow was still falling in thick, wet flakes that stuck to my hair and eyelashes. My nightgown provided almost no protection against the cold, and within minutes, I was shivering so violently. I could barely maintain my grip on the precious bills, but I kept running. Through the woods, along the creek bed that I knew would be frozen solid, following half-remembered paths from childhood adventures that seemed like they belonged to someone else's life. Every step was agony. My ankle was definitely sprained, possibly broken, and my bare feet were rapidly going numb from cold. But I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because I knew that if Marcus caught me now, after what I had done, there would be no mercy left in him at all. It took me nearly 2 hours to reach the main highway, 2 hours of stumbling through snow-covered wilderness in a thin nightgown, following instinct and desperation more than any clear plan. By the time I saw the faint glow of headlights through the trees, I was hypothermic, delirious, and barely conscious. I staggered onto the road just as a massive truck was approaching, its headlights sweeping across the snow like searchlights. For a moment, I thought the driver might not see me, a small figure in white against the white landscape. But the truck's brakes squealed as it came to a stop just yards from where I had collapsed in the middle of the asphalt. Jesus Christ. What the hell? The driver's door slammed, and heavy footsteps crunched through the snow toward me. Hey! Hey, kid, are you okay? I tried to answer, but my teeth were chattering so hard I could barely form words. Strong hands lifted me from the ground, and I found myself looking up into the weathered face of a man in his 50s, his eyes wide with shock and concern. My God, child, what are you doing out here? Where are your clothes? Your shoes? He was already shrugging out of his heavy coat, wrapping it around my shivering form. We need to get you warm. Fast. The truck's cab was blissfully warm, heated air rushing over my frozen skin like a blessing. The driver, his name was Frank Morrison, no relation to our town doctor, cranked the heat up even higher and dug a thermos of coffee from behind his seat. Small sips, he instructed, helping me hold the cup with hands that shook too badly to manage on my own. Slow and easy. Don't want you going into shock. As feelings slowly returned to my extremities and my shivering subsided enough for me to speak coherently, Frank asked the questions I had been dreading. What's your name, sweetheart? Where do you live? What happened to you? I stared out at the snowy landscape rushing past the truck's windows, my mind racing. The truth was impossible. No one would believe that a respectable boy like Marcus Patterson had driven his 10-year-old sister to flee into a blizzard wearing nothing but a nightgown. And even if they did believe it, they would send me back. They would return me to that house, to Marcus's tender mercies, and this time there would be no escape. My name is Ellen, I said finally, using a version of my real name that felt safer somehow. Ellen Smith. It was the most common surname I could think of, generic enough to be unremarkable. Ellen Smith, Frank repeated gently. Okay, Ellen, what about your family? Where are your parents? They're dead, I whispered, surprised by how easily the lie came. Car accident. I was staying with relatives, but they hurt me. So I ran. It wasn't entirely untrue, I told myself. My mother was dead. My father might as well be dead for all the protection he could offer. And Marcus was definitely hurting me. Frank's expression darkened with understanding and sympathy. Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. Those relatives, did they touch you in ways they shouldn't have? I nodded, unable to speak around the lump in my throat. Frank's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his jaw clenching with barely controlled anger. Bastards, he muttered under his breath. Then, louder. Okay, Ellen, here's what we're going to do. I'm taking you to the police station in Cumberland. That's about 50 miles from here. They'll know how to help you, how to make sure you're safe. No, the word burst out of me with such force that Frank actually jumped. Please, no police. They'll send me back. They'll make me go back to them. Frank glanced at me with troubled eyes. Ellen, sweetheart, the police are there to protect children, like you. If these relatives hurt you, you don't understand, I interrupted, desperation making my voice crack. They're respected people. Everyone thinks they're good. No one will believe me, and they'll send me back, and then—" I couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice what I knew Marcus would do to me if I was returned to his custody. Frank was quiet for a long moment. The only sound was the rumble of the truck's engine and the whisper of snow against the windshield. Finally, he sighed deeply. "My sister lives in Pittsburgh," he said slowly. "She runs a boarding house for women who need a fresh start. Women and girls who are running from bad situations. It's not exactly legal what she does, but it's safe. Would you like me to take you there instead?" Pittsburgh, a big city, hundreds of miles from Millbrook, where no one would know the name Patterson or have any reason to send a runaway girl back to her loving family. It sounded like paradise. "Yes," I breathed. "Please. Yes." The drive to Pittsburgh took 8 hours, with Frank stopping twice to let me rest and eat at truck stops where he carefully positioned himself between me and other customers, protecting me from curious stares and uncomfortable questions. He bought me a set of cheap clothes, jeans, a sweater, boots that were too big but infinitely better than bare feet, and a warm coat that swallowed my small frame. "Keep the change," he said, when I tried to pay him with some of my precious $27. "You're going to need every penny where you're going." As dawn broke over the industrial skyline of Pittsburgh, Frank pulled his truck up in front of a narrow 3-story building in a neighborhood that had seen better days. The sign hanging over the door read, "Haven House, rooms for rent," but Frank explained that his sister, Margaret, offered much more than simple lodging. "Maggie helps women who have nowhere else to go," he said as we climbed the front steps. "She doesn't ask too many questions, and she doesn't contact authorities unless someone wants her to. She'll keep you safe, Ellen. I promise." Margaret Morrison turned out to be a sturdy woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of hard work and harder experiences. She took one look at me, a 10-year-old girl in ill-fitting clothes, clutching a small roll of bills like a lifeline, and seemed to understand everything without needing explanation. "Another lamb who's lost her way," she said softly, ushering me into a warm kitchen that smelled of fresh bread and coffee. "Don't worry, child. You're safe now." Over the next few days, as I slowly began to believe that I had truly escaped Marcus's reach, Margaret explained how Haven House worked. It was home to 8 women of various ages, all of whom had fled from dangerous situations. There was Ruth, barely 18, who had run from a husband who beat her; Sarah, in her 30s, who had escaped a father who had been selling her services to his friends since she was 12; Mary, an older woman who had finally left her abusive children after decades of being their unpaid servant and victim. None of them asked me about my past, and I didn't ask about theirs. There was an unspoken understanding that whatever had brought us to Haven House was too painful to discuss casually. But there was also an underlying strength in these women, a determination to build new lives from the ashes of their old ones. Margaret assigned me to a small room on the 3rd floor that I shared with Ruth, who took me under her wing like an older sister. She taught me how to blend into the urban landscape, how to move through the city without drawing attention, how to answer questions in ways that satisfied curiosity without revealing dangerous truths. "The secret," Ruth told me one evening as we sat by the window watching the city lights twinkle in the darkness, "is to become someone new. Not just a new name, but a new person entirely. The girl you were before, she's dead. She has to be, or she'll drag you back to the place you ran from." I understood what she meant. Eleanor Patterson, the terrified child who had endured Marcus's abuse in silence, had died the moment I jumped from that window. In her place was Ellen Smith, a girl with no past and unlimited possibilities for her future. But even as I worked to construct this new identity, even as I learned to navigate the complexities of life in a big city, I couldn't completely escape the shadows of what I had left behind. At night, lying in the narrow bed I shared with Ruth, I would think about my father. Was he still sitting in that rocking chair, lost in memories of my mother? Had Marcus told him some story about my disappearance? Did he miss me? Or was his grief too complete for him to notice one more loss? And Marcus himself? What was he doing now that his primary victim had escaped? Part of me hoped that my absence would force him to confront his own darkness, that without me to torment, he might find his way back to something resembling normal behavior. But a larger, more realistic part of me suspected that he was simply looking for a replacement, another vulnerable target for his twisted desires. 3 months after my escape, Margaret sat me down for a conversation that would change the trajectory of my life yet again. "Ellen," she said gently, "you've been with us for almost a season now, and you've done wonderfully. You're stronger than when you arrived, more confident. But you're also still a child, and children need things that Haven House can't provide." My heart sank. Were they going to send me away? Make me go back? "Now, before you panic," Margaret continued, reading my expression accurately. "I'm not talking about sending you home. I know that's not an option for you. But you need education, proper schooling, and you need it in a place where no one will ask too many questions about your background." She pulled out a letter from her apron pocket, the envelope already opened. "I have a friend who runs a school for girls like you. Girls who need fresh starts. It's in Ohio, far enough from here that you'll be completely safe, but good enough to give you a real education. Would you be interested?" I looked at the letter, at this doorway to yet another new life, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years, hope for a future that extended beyond mere survival. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "When do I leave?" 2 weeks later, I was on another bus, traveling under the name Ellen Marie Smith, with a carefully constructed backstory and forged documents that would allow me to attend the Riverside Academy for Girls. In my pocket was a small address book with Margaret's information. Ruth's new address in Chicago, where she had moved to start fresh, and the contact details for Frank Morrison, the truck driver who had literally rescued me from the storm. As the bus carried me toward Ohio and toward the next chapter of my life, I pressed my face against the window and watched Pennsylvania disappear behind me. Somewhere in that state was a house where a monster still lived, where my broken father still grieved, where the ghost of my mother still whispered warnings that had come too late. But I was moving away from all of that now, toward something new and unknown, but infinitely better than what I had left behind. I was no longer Eleanor Patterson, victim and prisoner. I was Ellen Smith, survivor and architect of her own destiny. The hardest part was over. The running was done. Now came the even more challenging task of learning how to live. Riverside Academy for Girls sat on 30 acres of rolling Ohio countryside, a collection of red brick buildings connected by tree-lined pathways that looked nothing like the institutional facilities I had feared. When the bus dropped me off at the main gate on a crisp March morning in 1955, I felt like I was entering a different world entirely, one where girls my age walked freely across open spaces, laughed with friends, and carried books instead of secrets. The headmistress, Mrs. Adelaide Thornton, was a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and eyes that seemed to see straight through to your soul. She greeted me in her office, a warm room lined with books and filled with afternoon sunlight, with the kind of directness I was still learning to navigate. "Miss Smith," she said, consulting the file that Margaret Morrison had carefully prepared, "I understand you've had some challenging experiences in your young life. I want you to know that here at Riverside, we believe in looking forward, not backward. Your past is your own business unless you choose to share it." She leaned back in her leather chair, studying me with those penetrating eyes. "What matters to us is your potential, your willingness to learn, and your commitment to becoming the young woman you're meant to be. Can you give us those things?" "Yes, ma'am," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. "I want to learn. I want to be different than I was." Mrs. Thornton smiled, And for the first time since my mother's death, I felt truly seen by an adult, in a positive way. Different is exactly what we hope for, my dear. Different and better. The dormitory room I was assigned to was small but private, a luxury I hadn't expected after months of sharing space at Haven House. It contained a narrow bed with a blue cotton coverlet, a wooden desk positioned by the window, a dresser with a mirror that reflected back a girl I was still learning to recognize as myself. On the desk was a small vase with fresh daffodils, a welcome gesture that brought unexpected tears to my eyes. My roommate down the hall was a girl named Patricia Fleming, 15 years old with auburn curls and a laugh that could be heard from 3 rooms away. She had been at Riverside for 2 years, she told me, ever since her parents died in a factory fire, and her guardian proved to have inappropriate interests. The thing about this place, Patricia explained as she showed me around the campus that first afternoon, is that everybody's here for a reason. Some of us are orphans, some ran away from bad situations, some just needed a fresh start. But nobody asks questions you're not ready to answer. She pointed out the various buildings: the classroom block where academic subjects were taught, the arts building where girls could learn music, painting, and theater, the gymnasium where physical education and self-defense classes were held, and the dining hall where all meals were taken communally. Self-defense? I asked, catching on that detail. It seemed an unusual curriculum for a girls' school in 1955. Patricia's expression grew serious. Mrs. Thornton believes that every woman should know how to protect herself. She says too many girls end up victims because nobody ever taught them. They had the right to fight back. That evening, as I lay in my narrow bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a dormitory settling for the night, whispered conversations, muffled laughter, the soft closing of doors, I marveled at how different this felt from any place I had ever lived. There was no tension in the air, no sense of walking on eggshells, no fear of what might happen when darkness fell. For the first time in years, I slept through the entire night without waking. My academic placement tests revealed that despite the disruptions of the past year, I was actually ahead of my grade level in most subjects. Reading had been my escape during the worst times, and my mother had ensured I had a solid foundation in mathematics and writing before her illness took over our household. Mrs. Henderson, my primary teacher, decided to place me in classes with girls a year older, which suited me perfectly. I had always felt older than my chronological age anyway, but it was in Miss Catherine Walsh's literature class that I truly began to find my voice. Miss Walsh was a young teacher, probably no more than 25, with passionate opinions about the power of stories to change lives. She assigned us essays that went beyond simple book reports, asking us to explore themes that resonated with our own experiences. Every story, she told our class one April afternoon, is ultimately about transformation. Characters begin as one thing and through their experiences become something else. The question you must always ask yourself when reading is, what is this character learning about herself? And how does that relate to your own journey of becoming? For my first major essay, I chose to write about Jane Eyre, a character whose experiences with childhood abuse and institutional life felt uncomfortably familiar. But as I worked on the paper, something unexpected happened. Instead of focusing solely on Jane's suffering, I found myself writing about her resilience, her refusal to be broken by circumstances beyond her control, her ultimate triumph over those who had tried to diminish her. "Miss Smith," Miss Walsh said after returning my graded essay, "this is exceptional work. Have you considered that you might have a talent for writing?" The idea had never occurred to me. In my previous life, writing had been just another school assignment, something to be completed and forgotten. But here at Riverside, with time and safety to explore my own thoughts, I discovered that putting words on paper was a way of making sense of experiences too complex for casual conversation. Began keeping a journal, not of daily events, but of observations and reflections. I wrote about the way sunlight looked different when you weren't afraid, about how it felt to laugh without immediately looking over your shoulder to see who might be watching, about the strange process of learning to trust that kindness didn't always come with hidden costs. Physical education at Riverside was unlike anything I had experienced in public school. Instead of focusing solely on traditional sports, the program included what Mrs. Thornton called practical skills for modern women. We learned basic mechanics, how to change a tire, check oil levels, perform simple engine repairs. We studied household finances, including how to balance a checkbook, negotiate rent, and recognize predatory lending practices. And yes, we learned self-defense. Instructor Sarah Martinez, a compact woman with muscles like steel cables, taught us not just physical techniques but the mental preparation that made them effective. The most important thing, she told us during one memorable session, is to believe that you have the right to defend yourself. Too many women hesitate because they've been taught that fighting back isn't ladylike, or that their safety matters less than avoiding conflict. I'm here to tell you that's garbage. Your safety, your bodily autonomy, your right to say no, these are not negotiable. She taught us pressure points, escape techniques, and the kinds of everyday objects that could be used as weapons in an emergency. But more importantly, she taught us to project confidence, to walk and speak in ways that discouraged potential predators from seeing us as easy targets. Predators look for victims, she explained. They want someone who appears weak, isolated, unlikely to fight back or report them. When you carry yourself with confidence, when you make eye contact and speak clearly, you're signaling that you're not the easy target they're looking for. These lessons resonated with me in ways that had nothing to do with physical safety. I began to understand that my survival of Marcus's abuse hadn't been passive endurance. It had been an active choice to preserve some essential part of myself, despite his attempts to destroy it. I had been stronger than I realized, even in my weakest moments. Summer break presented a challenge I hadn't anticipated. Most of the girls returned home to families or guardians, but for students like Patricia and me, Riverside remained open, with a skeleton staff and a program of work-study opportunities. I chose to work in the school library, helping to catalog new acquisitions and repair damaged books. It was quiet work that suited my temperament, and it gave me unlimited access to reading material. I devoured everything from classic literature to contemporary psychology texts, trying to understand not just my own experiences, but the broader patterns of human behavior that had shaped them. One book in particular changed my perspective profoundly. The Second Sex, by Simone de Beauvoir. Reading about the systemic ways that women were conditioned to accept subordination, to see themselves as secondary beings whose primary value lay in serving others, helped me understand that what had happened to me wasn't personal failing or cosmic bad luck. It was part of a larger pattern of male dominance that relied on female silence and submission. This understanding was both liberating and enraging. Liberating because it meant I wasn't uniquely damaged or deserving of abuse. Enraging because it revealed how many other girls and women were suffering in silence, convinced that their victimization was somehow their fault. I began writing more seriously that summer, working on what I told myself was fiction, but which drew heavily from my own experiences. I wrote about a girl who escaped from a house of horrors, about the process of building a new identity, about the challenge of learning to trust in a world that had taught her that safety was an illusion. Miss Walsh, who remained at Riverside over the summer to work on her master's degree, agreed to read my stories and provide feedback. Her responses were encouraging, but also challenging. "You have a powerful voice, Ellen," she told me after reading a particularly difficult piece about a girl confronting her abuser in court. "But I sense you're holding back. There's more truth in these stories than you're willing to admit, isn't there?" I wasn't ready to discuss the autobiographical elements of my writing, but Miss Walsh's observation pushed me to dig deeper, to explore the emotional landscape of trauma and recovery with greater honesty. As my second year at Riverside began, I found myself in an unexpected position of leadership among the younger students. Girls who had recently arrived, frightened, damaged, uncertain about their futures, began seeking me out for advice and support. I discovered that sharing my hard-won wisdom about survival and recovery was deeply satisfying in ways I hadn't anticipated. One girl in particular, a 12-year-old named Susan who had been sold by her mother to pay drug debts, reminded me painfully of my younger self. She was small for her age, hollow-eyed, and so deeply mistrustful that she slept with a chair braced against her door and flinched whenever anyone approached her suddenly. "How do you know it gets better?" she asked me one October evening as we sat in the library after dinner. "How do you know you're ever really safe?" I thought carefully before answering, wanting to give her truth rather than empty reassurance. "You don't know," I said finally. "Safety isn't something you can guarantee forever. But you can learn to recognize real danger versus the echoes of old fears. You can build skills and relationships that make you stronger. And most importantly, you can choose to believe that you deserve better than what happened to you before." Susan nodded slowly, and I saw in her eyes the same desperate hope I had felt when Margaret Morrison first promised me sanctuary. That conversation crystallized something that had been developing in my mind for months. I wanted to spend my life helping other survivors, other girls who needed someone to show them that escape was possible, that healing was achievable, that their past didn't have to define their future. When Mrs. Thornton called me to her office in November to discuss my post-graduation plans, I was ready with my answer. "I want to become a social worker," I told her. "I want to work with children who have experienced trauma, help them find safe places and build new lives." Mrs. Thornton smiled, but her expression was also concerned. "That's admirable, Ellen, and I believe you would be excellent at it. But such work requires a college degree, and college requires documentation that might be difficult for someone in your situation to provide." She was right, of course. Ellen Smith existed only on paper in the carefully crafted identity that Margaret Morrison had created. There were no school records from before Riverside, no birth certificate, no family history that could withstand serious scrutiny. "However," Mrs. Thornton continued, "there may be another way. I have connections with several universities that have flexible admission policies for students with unusual circumstances. It would require some careful preparation, but I believe we could create a path forward for you." As winter settled over Riverside Academy, I threw myself into the work of building a college-ready academic record. I took advanced courses, participated in student government, wrote for the school newspaper, and volunteered with community organizations that served vulnerable populations. But even as I worked toward my future, I couldn't completely escape my past. Sometimes, lying in my narrow bed and listening to the winter wind rattle the windows, I would think about Millbrook, about my father, who would be approaching his second Christmas without my mother, about Marcus, who by now would be 15, and even more dangerous than when I had known him. Part of me wondered if I had a responsibility to report what he had done, to try to protect other potential victims. But the practical challenges were overwhelming. What proof could I offer? What would prevent him from simply denying everything and painting me as a disturbed runaway with a grudge? Instead, I focused on the future I was building, the life I was creating from the ashes of what had been destroyed. Ellen Smith would go to college, become a social worker, and would spend her life ensuring that other children didn't have to suffer in silence the way Eleanor Patterson had. It wasn't justice, exactly, but it was for a purpose, and sometimes, purpose is enough to build a life on. The acceptance letter from Oberlin College arrived on a gray February morning in 1958, 3 months before my graduation from Riverside Academy. Mrs. Thornton had worked miracles with her connections, creating an academic pathway that acknowledged my unusual circumstances without requiring the documentation that Ellen Smith couldn't provide. Full scholarship, Mrs. Thornton announced as she handed me the thick envelope, her eyes bright with pride. Academic merit and need-based. They were particularly impressed with your essay about working with trauma survivors. I held the letter, with trembling hands, reading it 3 times before the reality sank in. College, a real future. The chance to transform my survival into a career dedicated to helping others escape what I had escaped. But even as I celebrated this victory, a icy shadow fell across my joy. That same week, a letter arrived for me through the network Margaret Morrison maintained for her girls. It was from Frank, the truck driver who had saved my life that terrible December night 3 years earlier. Ellen, the letter began, written, in his careful, blocky handwriting, I hope you're doing well and staying safe. I'm writing because I thought you should know. There's been talk in the trucking community about a boy from your area, Marcus Patterson. He's been spotted at truck stops, asking drivers if they've seen a girl matching your description. Claims she's his sister who ran away after their mother died, and he's been looking for her ever since. He's persistent, and he's got a story that makes people want to help him. I wanted you to be careful and aware. The letter dropped from my numb fingers like a stone. 3 years. 3 years of building a new life, of learning to sleep without fear, of believing I had truly escaped. And Marcus was still hunting me. I showed the letter to Mrs. Thornton, who read it with growing concern. This changes nothing about your college plans, she said firmly. But it does mean we need to be even more careful about your identity. Ohio is far enough from Pennsylvania that you should be safe, but we'll make sure Oberlin understands the sensitivity of your situation. Graduation from Riverside Academy in June 1958 was bittersweet. I was excited about college, proud of what I had accomplished, grateful for the women who had nurtured my growth. But I was also leaving the first place where I had felt truly safe, venturing into a larger world where Ellen Smith would have to be more than just a name on forged documents. Oberlin College in the late 1950s was a haven for progressive thinking and social activism. It had been among the first institutions to admit both women and Black students, and its culture of challenging conventional wisdom suited my developing worldview perfectly. I threw myself into my studies with an intensity that impressed my professors and worried my friends. Social work classes gave an academic framework to experiences I understood viscerally. I learned about trauma responses, family systems theory, and intervention strategies. But more importantly, I learned that my insights as a survivor were valuable, that my perspective could contribute to understanding and healing that purely academic knowledge couldn't provide. During my sophomore year, I began volunteering at a local women's shelter, working with children whose mothers had fled domestic violence. These kids, ranging in age from toddlers to teenagers, carried the same haunted look I remembered from my own mirror. They flinched at sudden movements, slept poorly, and struggled to trust any adult authority figure during my sophomore year. I began volunteering at a local women's shelter, working with children whose mothers had fled domestic violence. These kids, ranging in age from toddlers to teenagers, carried the same haunted look I remembered from my own mirror. They flinched at sudden movements, slept poorly, and struggled to trust any adult authority figure. This understanding was both liberating and enraging. Liberating because it meant I wasn't uniquely damaged or deserving of abuse. Enraging because it revealed how many other girls and women were suffering in silence, convinced that their victimization was somehow their fault. I began writing more seriously that summer, working on what I told myself was fiction but which drew heavily from my own experiences. I wrote about a girl who escaped from a house of horrors, about the process of building a new identity, about the challenge of learning to trust in a world that had taught her that safety was an illusion. Miss Walsh, who remained at Riverside, over the summer to work on her master's degree, agreed to read my stories and provide feedback. Her responses were encouraging, but also challenging. "You have a powerful voice, Ellen," she told me after reading a particularly difficult piece about a girl confronting her abuser in court. But I sense you're holding back. There's more truth in these stories than you're willing to admit, isn't there? I wasn't ready to discuss the autobiographical elements of my writing, but Miss Walsh's observation pushed me to dig deeper, to explore the emotional landscape of trauma and recovery with greater honesty. As my second year at Riverside began, I found myself in an unexpected position of leadership among the younger students. Girls who had recently arrived, frightened, damaged, uncertain about their futures, began seeking me out for advice and support. I discovered that sharing my hard-won wisdom about survival and recovery was deeply satisfying in ways I hadn't anticipated. One girl in particular, a 12-year-old named Susan who had been sold by her mother to pay drug debts, reminded me painfully of my younger self. She was small for her age, hollow-eyed, and so deeply mistrustful that she slept with a chair braced against her door and flinched whenever anyone approached her suddenly. "How do you know it gets better?" she asked me one October evening as we sat in the library after dinner. "How do you know you're ever really safe?" I thought carefully before answering, wanting to give her truth rather than empty reassurance. "You don't know," I said finally. "Safety isn't something you can guarantee forever, but you can learn to recognize real danger versus the echoes of old fears. You can build skills and relationships that make you stronger. And most importantly, you can choose to believe that you deserve better than what happened to you before." Susan nodded slowly, and I saw in her eyes the same desperate hope I had felt when Margaret Morrison first promised me sanctuary. That conversation crystallized, something that had been developing in my mind for months. I wanted to spend my life helping other survivors, other girls who needed someone to show them that escape was possible, that healing was achievable, that their past didn't have to define their future. When Mrs. Thornton called me to her office in November to discuss my post-graduation plans, I was ready with my answer. "I want to become a social worker," I told her. "I want to work with children who have experienced trauma, help them find safe places and build new lives." Mrs. Thornton smiled, but her expression was also concerned. "That's admirable, Ellen, and I believe you would be excellent at it. But such work requires a college degree, and college requires documentation that might be difficult for someone in your situation to provide." She was right, of course. Ellen Smith existed only on paper, in the carefully crafted identity that Margaret Morrison had created. There were no school records from before Riverside, no birth certificate, no family history that could withstand serious scrutiny. "However," Mrs. Thornton continued, "there may be another way. I have connections with several universities that have flexible admission policies for students with unusual circumstances. It would require some careful preparation, but I believe we could create a path forward for you." As winter settled over Riverside Academy, I threw myself into the work of building a college-ready academic record. I took advanced courses, participated in student government, wrote for the school newspaper, and volunteered with community organizations that served vulnerable populations. But even as I worked toward my future, I couldn't completely escape my past. Sometimes, lying in my narrow bed and listening to the winter wind rattle the windows, I would think about Millbrook, about my father, who would be approaching his second Christmas without my mother, about Marcus, who by now would be 15, and even more dangerous than when I had known him. Part of me wondered if I had a responsibility to report what he had done, to try to protect other potential victims. But the practical challenges were overwhelming. What proof could I offer? What would prevent him from simply denying everything and painting me as a disturbed runaway with a grudge? Instead, I focused on the future I was building, the life I was creating from the ashes of what had been destroyed. Ellen Smith would go to college, become a social worker, and would spend her life ensuring that other children didn't have to suffer in silence the way Eleanor Patterson had. It wasn't justice. Exactly. But it was for a purpose. And sometimes purpose is enough to build a life on. The acceptance letter from Oberlin College arrived on a gray February morning in 1958, 3 months before my graduation from Riverside Academy. Mrs. Thornton had worked miracles with her connections, creating an academic pathway that acknowledged my unusual circumstances without requiring the documentation that Ellen Smith couldn't provide. "Full scholarship," Mrs. Thornton announced as she handed me the thick envelope, her eyes bright with pride. "Academic merit and need-based. They were particularly impressed with your essay about working with trauma survivors." I held the letter with trembling hands, reading it 3 times before the reality sank in. College, a real future. The chance to transform my survival into a career dedicated to helping others escape what I had escaped. But even as I celebrated this victory, shadow fell across my joy. That same week, a letter arrived for me through the network Margaret Morrison maintained for her girls. It was from Frank, the truck driver who had saved my life that terrible December night 3 years earlier. "Ellen," the letter began, written in his careful, blocky handwriting, "I hope you're doing well and staying safe. I'm writing because I thought you should know. There's been talk in the trucking community about a boy from your area, Marcus Patterson. He's been spotted at truck stops, asking drivers if they've seen a girl matching your description. Claims she's his sister who ran away after their mother died, and he's been looking for her ever since. He's persistent, and he's got a story that makes people want to help him. I wanted you to be careful and aware." The letter dropped from my numb fingers like a stone. 3 years. 3 years of building a new life, of learning to sleep without fear, of believing I had truly escaped. And Marcus was still hunting me. I showed the letter to Mrs. Thornton, who read it with growing concern. "This changes nothing about your college plans," she said firmly. "But it does mean we need to be even more careful about your identity. Ohio is far enough from Pennsylvania that you should be safe, but we'll make sure Oberlin understands the sensitivity of your situation." Graduation from Riverside Academy in June 1958 was bittersweet. I was excited about college, proud of what I had accomplished, grateful for the women who had nurtured my growth. But I was also leaving the first place where I had felt truly safe, venturing into a larger world where Ellen Smith would have to be more than just a name on forged documents. Oberlin College in the late 1950s was a haven for progressive thinking and social activism. It had been among the first institutions to admit both women and Black students, and its culture of challenging conventional wisdom suited my developing worldview perfectly. I threw myself into my studies with an intensity that impressed my professors and worried my friends. Social work classes gave an academic framework to experiences I understood viscerally. I learned about trauma responses, family systems theory, and intervention strategies. But more importantly, I learned that my insights as a survivor were valuable, that my perspective could contribute to understanding and healing that purely academic knowledge couldn't provide. During my sophomore year, I began volunteering at a local women's shelter, working with children whose mothers had fled domestic violence. These kids, ranging in age from toddlers to teenagers, carried the same haunted look I remembered from my own mirror. They flinched at sudden movements, slept poorly, and struggled to trust any adult authority figure during my sophomore year. I began volunteering at a local women's shelter, working with children whose mothers had fled domestic violence. These kids, ranging in age from toddlers to teenagers, carried the same haunted look I remembered from my own mirror. They flinched at sudden movements, slept poorly, and struggled to trust any adult authority figure. But they also responded to me in ways that amazed the shelter staff. Maybe it was because I never promised them that everything would be fine, never told them to just forget what had happened. Instead, I acknowledged their pain, validated their fear, and showed them through my own presence that survival was possible. "You have a gift," said Dr. Patricia Williams, the shelter's director. "These children see something in you that they recognize. You should consider specializing in childhood trauma when you graduate." In 1962, I graduated from Oberlin with honors and a bachelor's degree in social work. I was 27 years old, though my official documents claimed I was 21. The discrepancy didn't matter to the Cleveland Department of Children and Family Services, who hired me immediately to work with their most challenging cases. My first assignment was a 7-year-old girl named Lucy, whose stepfather had been arrested for sexual abuse. She hadn't spoken since the investigation began, and 3 previous social workers had made no progress in reaching her. I sat with Lucy in the sterile interview room, not pushing for conversation, just being present. On my 3rd visit, I brought colored pencils and paper. "I used to draw when I felt scared," I told her simply. Sometimes pictures can say things that words can't. Lucy's first drawing was all black scribbles, violent and angry. But gradually, over weeks of patient sessions, colors began to appear. A small figure hiding under a bed, a door with multiple locks. Finally, a girl standing in sunlight, arms raised toward the sky. "She's free," Lucy whispered, her first words in months. She got away from the monster. My success with cases like Lucy's earned me a reputation within the department. I was the worker they called when traditional approaches failed. When children were too traumatized to respond to conventional therapy, my caseload grew, and with it, my sense of purpose. In 1965, I met David Chen, a psychiatrist who had been hired to provide mental health services to our agency. He was kind, brilliant, and completely uninterested in prying into my carefully constructed past. Our friendship developed slowly into something deeper, but it took me 2 years to trust him enough to share even the basics of my real story. "Eleanor," he said quietly after I finished my abbreviated account of growing up in Millbrook. "That's your real name, isn't it? Eleanor, not Ellen." The fact that he had noticed the shift in how I referred to myself, the way my voice changed. When I spoke about my childhood, both terrified and thrilled me. Someone saw through my carefully maintained facade and still chose to love me. We married in 1968, a small ceremony with my chosen family from Riverside Academy and Haven House. Margaret Morrison, now in her 60s but still running her boarding house, served as my matron of honor. Mrs. Thornton, retired but still sharp as a tack, gave me away. Frank Morrison, the truck driver who had saved my life, walked me down the aisle. David never pushed me for more details about my past, but he understood the work that drove me. Together, we established a treatment program for children who had experienced severe trauma, combining his psychiatric expertise with my survivor's insight. Our daughter, Sarah, was born in 1971, followed by our son Michael in 1974. Holding my babies for the first time, I was overwhelmed by the fierce protectiveness I felt, the absolute determination that they would never experience the fear and violation that had defined my childhood. As the years passed, my reputation in the field of childhood trauma grew. I published articles about survivor-informed treatment approaches, spoke at conferences about the long-term effects of family-based abuse, and trained new social workers in recognizing signs of sexual trauma in children. But through it all, Marcus remained a shadow at the edge of my consciousness. Reports filtered through my network occasionally. Frank's letter in college had been followed by others over the years. Marcus Patterson, now a man in his 30s, still made periodic inquiries about his missing sister. He had never married, never seemed to hold steady employment, and displayed what several people described as an unhealthy obsession with finding me. In 1978, the shadow became reality. I was leaving a conference in Chicago when I saw him across the hotel lobby, older, harder, but unmistakably Marcus. Our eyes met for one terrible moment across the crowded space, and I saw recognition flare in his face. I didn't wait to see what he would do. I ran, pushing through the crowd, my heart hammering with 24-year-old terror. In my hotel room, I called David, called hotel security, called everyone I could think of who might help. but Marcus was gone when security arrived, vanished as if he had never been there. The desk clerk confirmed that no one by that name was registered, though he could have been using an alias. I spent 3 sleepless days in that hotel, afraid to venture out, before flying home to Cleveland. That encounter forced a conversation David and I had been avoiding for years. My false identity, which had served me so well for decades, was becoming a liability. Ellen Smith had built a career, published articles, and gained recognition in her field. If Marcus exposed the deception, everything I had worked for could crumble. With David's support and legal assistance from friends who specialized in identity issues for abuse survivors, I began the process of legally reclaiming my birth name. In 1980, Ellen Smith officially became Eleanor Patterson Chen, with court documents that acknowledged my history while protecting my privacy. The process was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. For the first time in 26 years, I could speak my real name without fear, and could acknowledge my Pennsylvania origins without elaborate deceptions. But more importantly, it allowed me to step fully into my role as an advocate. I began speaking publicly about my experiences, writing about the journey from victim to survivor to helper. My book, Breaking the Silence: A Survivor's Guide to Healing, was published in 1985 and became required reading in social work programs across the country. Now, at 78, I sit in my garden in suburban Cleveland, surrounded by grandchildren who know their grandmother as a woman of strength and compassion. They know I work with children who have been hurt, that I help families heal from terrible experiences. They don't know the specifics of my own childhood. They're too young for those dark details, but they see the result of that transformation daily. Marcus Patterson died in 1992, alone in a Pennsylvania boarding house, having never found the sister who escaped his control 40 years earlier. I felt no satisfaction in his death, only a kind of hollow relief that the hunt was finally over. Sometimes people ask me how I survived, how I transformed such trauma into a life of service and love. The answer isn't simple, and it isn't something that can be replicated exactly by anyone else. But I tell them this: healing happens in community, through the kindness of strangers who choose to help rather than hurt, through the slow process of rebuilding trust in yourself and others. I tell them that surviving isn't enough. We must learn to live. And sometimes, if we're very lucky and very determined, we can transform our deepest wounds into sources of strength that help others find their way out of darkness. My name is Eleanor Patterson Chen. I am a survivor, a social worker, a wife, a mother, and a grandmother. I am living proof that no matter how dark the night becomes, dawn always comes for those who refuse to give up hope. That little girl who jumped from a window into a December storm didn't just survive, she learned to fly. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.